Good evening, and welcome to the Smithsonian American Art Museum for the second event in this year's Clarice Smith Distinguished Lecture Series. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, there are just a few housekeeping details to take care of. Please turn off your cell phones, pagers, and other electronic devices. We don't want to come across like the FAA, but even when they are mute, they can interfere with the auditorium's sound system, so please turn them off. This program is being webcast, so if you would like to ask a question or make a comment following Mr. Gopnik's talk, please make use of the microphones located in either aisle. Also, there will be a reception directly after this program upstairs in the Kogod Courtyard. I do hope you'll join us there. And please mark your calendars for November 7th, which will be the final event in this year's series, to hear artist Carrie James Marshall's talk, Seen and Not Heard. My name is Teresa Slowick, and I've had the pleasure of working at the Smithsonian American Art Museum with a wonderful collection and a terrific group of valued colleagues for nearly 20 years. It's not a bad gig. But tonight, I'm sure that you, as I am, are all aglow with anticipation of what's an exceptional event. The Clarice Smith series, which was launched in 2004, was an idea hatched between our director, Betsy Brune, and longtime patron, Clarice Smith, whose generosity to this museum and other institutions has transformed the region's cultural landscape. Please help me thank Clarice Smith for her generosity. Tonight, thanks to Clarice, we have with us Adam Gopnik, an intelligent and insightful critic of American culture who's come to the museum to give us his take on what makes American art American. Mr. Gopnik has written about art as art critic at The New Yorker and elsewhere, about food, about family, baseball, Babar the Elephant, Shakespeare as everyday poet, life in Paris, and life in New York. I'm sure everyone here has read Paris to the Moon, probably both in its original form in The New Yorker and in the book published in 2001. If you haven't also read his literary anthology, Americans in Paris, it's a wonderful companion to the earlier book. You'll revel in musings on the City of Light by American expats and tourists, from Abigail Adams to Langston Hughes to Jack Kerouac. There's a long tradition of artists, both literary and visual, traveling to Europe, especially Paris, to practice their art and in the process discover themselves. Mr. Gopnik has made that pilgrimage and shared its fruits with all of us. His collaboration with Kirk Varnedoe in 1991 on the groundbreaking exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, High and Low, Modern Art and Popular Culture, made waves and rocked boats in the best possible way. He has consistently won awards for his writing, and if you haven't read Winter, 5 Windows on the Season, head straight to Politics and Prose on your way home and pick up a copy. Most importantly, he has won the ears and hearts of all of his readers. Please join me in welcoming Adam Gopnik.
Thank you. Thank you, Teresa, for that lovely introduction. I am grateful to you for saying those nice things. It is true that I write about lots of different stuff in lots of different ways, and you may be asking, what right does he have to speak to us about American art? What makes American art American? One simple answer is that I am now 22 years late on an advance for a book about American art, which I contracted to do in 1990 and have yet to deliver. I assume no one here is from Random House waiting for the book. This is bad. But it is better than being 28 years late with my thesis, my PhD thesis on the same subject. I think that's an accumulated weight of about 50 years of procrastination on this subject, or if you want to see it another way, 50 cumulative years of meditation on the subject, whose fruits I'll try and bring you tonight. Along with the professional guilt that inevitably haunts me at night and haunts my good wife through the day, wondering when the rest of the advance is coming in, I hope there is a certain amateur's freedom that emerges in that way. It's a certain freedom of irresponsibility. I don't stand before you as a scholar or a curator with any kind of institutional responsibility, but like most of you in this audience, I suspect, I am a museum goer. I am a gallery goer. I get no thrill as large as I do from simply setting foot in a museum and beginning to look. Even the experience, which has claimed most of my Washington, D.C. family tonight, of going to a baseball stadium and watching a great game, doesn't compare for me quite to the pleasure of going to a museum and thinking about what I found. One of the things I do when I go to museums, particularly when I'm looking at American art, is to ask myself, what's going to be the image on that book about American art, the cover image on the book about American art, when I finally get it written? And right now, the image that has pride of place is this. I betray this wonderful picture a little bit by showing it to you at this scale. It's actually a miniature, a beautiful miniature by an amazing American artist, an American woman named Sarah Goodridge. She painted this in 1823. She was already in her 40s, by the way, as by legend and probably in fact as a gift to the great Daniel Webster, with whom she had an ongoing relationship. And she gave this the wonderful title, which I might use for that book on American art, Beauty Revealed. Beauty Revealed. It's a picture whose utter audacity, I think, still dazzles us. Many of you who have studied our history will have heard much said about the male gaze and its horrors. That is the practice in so much erotic or voluptuous seeming art for it to be directed at a man's eye from a man's point of view. But this is very much both an erotic and, in every sense, a kind of feminist statement. This is saying, my self-portrait includes my sexuality, and I am unafraid and unashamed to present it to you, Daniel Webster. That's something profoundly American about that enterprise, about that attempt. It's not something you could easily find duplicated on any scale elsewhere in the Western world around that same time in 1823. Beauty Revealed. That's one image, if I could get away with it, and one title that I thought of. Another, though, before I race ahead, simply has to do with the prevalence, which I'm always noting, I'm sure you've noted too, of birds in early American art. They're decoys and Audubon and endless numbers of duck decoys. I'm a city boy, so I don't even know what they're used for, but I know they're always there when you walk into a gallery of American art. And I asked a curator once, what did they represent, expecting some kind of complicated explanation of the social history of plover and duck decoys in America. And she answered simply, oh, it's because we have so many birds. I thought that was a beautiful answer. So many birds, so many birds. It would have been Audubon's answer too if you had asked him why he attempted that wonderful encyclopedic compendium of every imaginable bird in America. So many birds implies both abundance and simplicity. So maybe the collected title of it should be So Many Birds and Beauty Revealed, or Beauty Revealed in So Many Birds. Let me, if you'll allow me, let me just run through some things. The talk I want to give to you tonight really has three parts, three acts, any one of which I am balefully aware as I went through my lecture notes could serve as an independent lecture. But I want to try and do a little bit of it all for you tonight. First thing I want to do is look a little bit at the range, the variety of American art, and begin to ask the question, is there any commonality? Is there any common spirit amongst an art that seems very often to get its greatest energies from its most eccentric corners? There have been many attempts. My wonderful and tragically late friend Robert Hughes did an entire television series called American Visions, trying to identify continuities within American art. My equally wonderful and thankfully ever present, though no longer in Washington, brother Blake Gopnik has written often to dispute that view, to insist that all of the seeming continuities of American art are merely illusory and are projected in by overly chauvinistic art historians into American art. Two extreme ways of looking at it. What can we find to identify, begin to identify as continuity and commonality? That's the first thing. Second thing I want to talk about a bit is the institutional life of American art. Because the institutional life of American art, the way it gets put into museums and galleries, is, I think, very different from the institutional life of other kinds of art, other kinds of national art in the world. And finally, I want to ask in Act 3 if there's a sane and reasonable way in which we can keep both that Hughesian vision of the continuities of American art and pay respect to that younger brother vision of the non-continuities. We can protect ourselves from the risk of being merely jingoistic, self-congratulatory when we look at it. Let me just show you, in plain English, some things I like. When I go across the street to the Metropolitan Museum and I walk through their American wing, these are kind of my top 10 things that I am drawn to over and over again. This is Head's Approaching Thunderstorm from 1859. Bingham's Fur Traders Descending the Missouri from 1845. John F. Peto's Old Souvenirs and Harnet's The Artist's Letter Rack from 1879. One of my favorite of all American pictures, Thomas Aiken's The Champion Single Skulls from 1871, and one I like even more by that other great master of American empiricism, Winslow Homer's Searchlight on the Harbor Entrance from 1901. Here's a picture, we're talking about Americans in Paris, which I first discovered, a wonderful show in recent years of art made by Americans in Paris. This is Cecilia Beau, a too little known woman artist, and this is called Ernesta, Child with Nurse from 1894. St. Galden's wonderful medallion of Robert Louis Stevenson, a low relief coin. Here's one of those little plovers. This is actually done. We know the name of the artist who did it, Elmer Crowell's black-bellied plover decoy. And then we can look farther and outside the normal realm and the normal limits and constraints of American art to something like this wonderful phrenological head. We can even find things that strike us as amazingly contemporary and provocative in what were meant originally as jokes. This picture attributed to Enoch Wood Perry in the 1840s called The True American. I think as you look, just walk with me, so to speak, through the halls of any decent collection of American art, and you find that kind of variety, a certain lightness of touch, and a certain remarkable broadness of manner, a way in which our accepted idea of American art always sort of spreads wider than our ideas of most other national styles. We see a way in which our idea of American art crosses over time and time again with folk art, with duck decoys, with phrenological heads, with newspaper jokes. All of that, I think, is very much part of the inner image that we have of American art. If you think about it, after all, if we were trying to tell the story of American art to someone, we'd be likelier, I think, to be persuasive if we started our story with Audubon, the painter of birds and beasts, rather than with somebody who was setting out in a more conventionally European way to paint portraits of men and women, men especially, of power. There seems to be a certain kind of broadness of possibility in our image of American art that's quite remarkable. And yet, within that broadness, we see, I think, begin to glimpse, begin to sense, begin to smell, if you like, certain continuities, even in that quick stroll we just took. There seems to be, for instance, a kind of lyrical overinvestment in the overlooked object, in the way that Harnett and Peto make something not just illusionistic and striking as a trick out of their newspapers and their tram tickets, but something that seems to involve taking the very thing that you'd be inclined to reject as the materials of art and investing it with scrutiny, investing it with a kind of close, nuanced, introspective examination that in Europe would be more likely given to an obviously acceptable still life subject. There's a way in which, again and again in American art, we see a kind of understatement recharged as overstatement, simplicity itself as a kind of dramatic form. I think, for instance, that wonderful Bingham of the Missouri moves us exactly because it's so mysteriously anti-dramatic. Or we think about the Homer, that wonderful Homer, moves us, I think, exactly because it's hyper-dramatic. Something is happening, but we'll never know what. We never can see exactly what's happening. Where's the battle? Over there somewhere. This idea of the small side thing taken as seriously as the main central event, that seems somehow to be terribly national, terribly part of what we are and the way that we think about our art. Now, one thing, though, I said I wanted to talk a little bit about the institutional life of American art, and one of the things that I think that is likely to strike us when we think about that institutional life is that we have wings and galleries, museums of American art. If you think about it, you cannot go to Paris and visit a museum of French art, nor if you are in Italy will you see a gallery devoted to Italian art. In those two highly visual and deeply entrenched cultures, one takes it for granted that their art is at the center of existence and doesn't need a kind of national excuse, doesn't need a national explanation to justify its presence. And yet in the history of American art, we have again and again tried to explain it, tried to place it, tried to justify it. It's why we have an American wing at the Met, why we have the American Museum here at the Smithsonian. One of our attempts to make ourselves equal, to put ourselves on common ground with the Europeans, has been again and again to say our art is genuinely interesting. It's not just a cadet provincial version of something that you can see elsewhere. It has intrinsic value of its own, of a very different kind than you can find elsewhere in the world, but of equal value. So again and again, if you look at the history of the writing of the history of American art, as I've tried to do in preparing this unfinished book, you'll see that there are kind of two contradictory impulses always at play. One is to try and make American art as much like all the other arts of the world as you can, to compare it to French art or to Italian art, to insist on its majesty, on its authority, that it can take on any other art on those equal terms. And the other, just as much, is to insist that American art has some stubborn quiddity, some individuality that makes it property not like any other. So there's a kind of oscillation between what we might call American exceptionalism, that is to be accepted, ACC exceptionalism, versus American exceptionalism. We're not like anybody else. One of the things that is likely to strike you if you look at the history of the institutions of American art, places where American art has been shown, ways that it's been talked about from very early on, is that it has been almost uniquely inclusive in its sense of what its objects and what its subject matter is. Audubon and Homer, to take a very obvious example, an illustrator, an ornithological illustrator, and a man who spent much of his life as a newspaper illustrator, Winslow Homer, before he became respectable. These are crucial figures. No one would argue that they are crucial and central, if you like, so to speak, canonic figures in American art, and yet they begin their work not at the center through art school and the normal critical receptions, but at the edges where high art is not normally expected to be made. Limners and sign painters and duck decoy makers and makers of erotic miniatures intended for an audience of one. This is very much the kind of material of American art in its institutional form as we think about it from the very beginning. Shaker furniture, to take a case obvious and dear to my own heart, is quite arguably more interesting, not only more original, but in many ways more beautiful than any of the more conventional academic sculpture that surrounds it in the 19th century, and part of the American story, and always included in, from the very beginnings of the institutional life of collections of American art, the decorative arts, illustration, scientific drawing have always been displayed on more or less even terms. Isn't that true, you might ask, of Adam interiors or Omerlou clocks or faience ware in France or England? Yes, partly, but never on quite the same omnivorous, and if you like, democratic terms that we've tended to include the full range of our visual culture in our official institutions of American art. Now, there's a simple reason why that should be the case, it seems to me. This notion that Winslow Homer and the weather vane both belong to the story of American art. One simple common sense reason is we don't have that much of it. We have to include everything because if we didn't include everything, we wouldn't have enough. Some truth in that. Some truth in that. But I think there's also been a sense from very early on that we can only grasp or attempt to understand American art if we take it in whole, if we don't try and focus too narrowly on one art historical path leading from gallery to apprentice to master to museum, but instead expand our vision and expand our view. Indeed, if you study the archaeology, so to speak, the institutional archaeology of the museums and the institutions of American art, it runs very much counter to the normal current. In most places, in most institutions, painting and sculpture were always the obvious big boys not by accident, while folk and decorative and interior arts have only slowly begun to demand not just a place at the table, but equality in the galleries. That was one of the implicit subjects of that controversial High and Low show I did with Kirk Varnado 20-some years ago. For instance, in 1909, though, on the occasion of New York State's Hudson Fulton celebration, the Metropolitan Museum in New York mounted a temporary display of American art, the first appearance of an American wing at this great merchants museum devoted largely to the masterpiece, the newly collected masterpieces of European art. It mounted its first American display as a display of furniture, silver, ceramics, and family portraits. Even when the American wing proper opened at the Metropolitan, a very similar story could be told here at the Smithsonian, it was in a permanent 3-story period room, a kind of period house. So that urge, not so much to level as to include, has been very much part of the institutional life of American art from the very beginning. Now, I said one reason for that, one way you can explain that is to simply say when you don't have enough, you spread it thinner and you use everything you've got. But I think there's another reason for that, and a more interesting reason, and that is that sort of by an accident of history, we see American art typically from the wrong end of the telescope. That's to say that the crisis of modernism, the 19th century crisis, struck American art just as it was emerging from its cradle. From tentative beginnings in a country that couldn't afford or couldn't support an art establishment here in America, it came of age, American art began to come of age at a time when no one any longer wanted a proper art establishment. One of the things that art historians are always trained never to say, every field and every world has its taboos, and one of the taboos, if you study art history, academic art history, is you're never supposed to say that photography, the introduction of photography, altered the course of art dramatically. We try and talk about how the course of art altered from its own internal needs, but of course that's not true. One of the things that happened is once you have a photographic image that's doing the conventional work of portraiture, of preservation of places and homes and people, you no longer have an obvious an ecological niche for art, and everything gets thrown into dispute. Everything gets thrown into, if you like, a kind of beautiful chaos, a constant search for what art, in this sense, will do. And that's exactly the moment in the mid-19th century when American art begins to take itself seriously. So you might say that it's in the DNA of American art to be questioning in that way, to be asking itself always not just what does great art look like, but also what kinds of things should art be. It's there if you examine the lives of any of the great makers of American art, Homer and Audubon and Mary Cassatt, constant kind of questioning about how big art has to be to register big. Can you make a work just out of bird illustration? Can you make it, as Mary Cassatt did, out of Japanese-inspired studies of mothers and babies, not a subject that had ever occupied the central ring of art before? That kind of intense self-examination, that urge to take subject matter and media from the margins and make them central is, as I say, attendant on the birth of American art as a self-conscious form. Even our taste running backwards for so many things that in that stroll, that imaginary stroll through the Metropolitan we just took, even our tastes are remade, if you like, by modernism. One of the reasons we see Harnett and Peto and the American Illusionists as something more than just jokesters is because Joseph Cornell and Stuart Davis have instructed us to see in mere torn and collected souvenirs vital signs of the psyche. And we love Shaker furniture in part because our eyes have been instructed by the American minimalists to see simplicity as potentially sublime. Now, having said that, having suggested to you, I hope, that there is something inherently, if you like, democratic, inherently crisis-ridden, inherently fluid and changing, more inclined to seek meaning from the margins in the institutional life of American art than in almost any other national art I know. The question then comes, is there any commonality? Is there that continuity I spoke of at the beginning of my talk tonight that we can identify that's something more than just this habit of taking a little bit Chinese restaurant style from column A, column B, decorative arts, ornithological illustration, we'll put it all together and call it American art? Is there some true formal or spiritual or semantic, some actual continuity that goes beyond this institutional practice caused, I think, by the birth of American art at a time when what art was very much in play? Is there a real commonality? Is there a real unity to it? Well, I have my own theory of the case, a kind of truly unified field theory, what physicists call a theory of everything when it comes to American art. And it has some of the characteristics of physicists' theory of everything and some of the characteristics of the kinds of things that get passed out to you in the subway, explaining the entire world on terms that you may or may not find persuasive. But when I look at American art, when I was here at the opening of the Smithsonian, the reopening, I spoke about this a bit. When I look at American art and I search not just for the institutional commonality, but for, if you like, the artistic, the essential commonality, I see over and over again, I see two things. I see on the one hand, as in the Audubon to my right, we see a collecting impulse, an inventorying impulse, a desire to make art not just from the marginal or the modest as Audubon did. Remember what Audubon's project was. Audubon's project was not to do a kind of hierarchical study of great birds, eventually working his way round to lesser birds, and do the same thing with the quadrupeds, do the big ones, and then eventually work your way round to the mice. Not a bit. His project, from the very beginning, when he first arrived at it after his bankruptcy, after he had failed at everything else in his life, was to do every single beast and every single bird that could be found in North America, and to do them, so to speak, sort of pell-mell, to do them without an obvious organizational hierarchy in the way that he presented them in his books, in his life. That impulse to inventory, that impulse to catalog, that impulse which we associate with the poetry of Walt Whitman, perhaps most memorably, to make out of the cataloging of the everyday objects and experiences something that can compete with the religious art of Europe, something that will have a religious aura of its own. That's a very deep and powerful instinct in American art. I like to call it the art of the overabundant larder. Because one of the truths of the American experience was the realization from early on that this was a continent in many ways blessed with a lot, and that a commercial civilization like ours is one that produced a lot of things. There was a lot of natural stuff, and there was a lot of cultural stuff. It was made without clear discrimination between good and bad. It was made without clear discriminations between great-looking birds and ugly-looking birds. And that impulse to inventory and catalog, to simply make a list of that overabundant larder and present it at art, is one that's very, very powerful, I think, in American art. Against that lies the art of what I like to think of as the art of the luminous oblong blur. You may recall that there was an evangelist in the 1920s, and someone asked him once, how do you see God? How do you imagine God? And he said, I see a luminous oblong blur. That sense, which you also find in American art, that art can give us spiritual experience, a vision of another world, a vision of transcendence and the sublime, simply by the act of making it, is also very deep. I show you here, contemporary with Audubon, one of my favorite drawings, one of the most mysterious Blakean drawings in American art. This is Hannah Cahoon's The Shining Tree of Life, a young Shaker girl who had a vision of this tree and set about making these visionary drawings of this amazing blazing tree of life. And what's so interesting about it is the idea that you can simply proceed, if you like, immediately from the sublime experience in your head to the particular experience on paper. That is, W.H. Auden once said that the thing that annoyed him most in America was the American conviction that once the right gimmick is found, it will be possible to build the New Jerusalem in 20 minutes. Well, this may be an annoying trait of American life, but it's been a very powerful and creative impulse in American art. We don't think you need a lot of intermediary institutions or a lot of intermediary acts just to get at the thing itself. It's the same kind of play that I think we find between Bingham and the luminous. It's one of the things that we've always attached now in contemporary terms, that is to say reading back from our contemporary experience into luminism, is exactly the luminous oblong blur, the sense that the simple play of light in the world is a fully sufficient vision of God's relationship to man. Not just, as you can find in European art, a kind of tussle of anxiety and observation, but if the thing looks great, it comes to us direct from heaven. And against that is the impulse to simply show us things as they are, again and again. I could go through, and someday when I write that book, I shall go through the many, many, many instantiations of that principle, of that doubleness, of that duality, that oscillation between the overabundant larder and the luminous oblong blur in American art as a creative principle. Here I show you one of my favorite contemporary incarnations of it. On my right, of course, the wonderful Wayne Thiebaud's Cakes. On the left, James Turrell, piece made out of pure light. Two artists working in California in the same time, both of them spiritual artists in a very real sense, devoted to art not for what it can do as social commentary or as cultural analysis, but for what art can do as art. And Thiebaud arrives at kind of the ultimate expression of the art of the overabundant larder, an art made up of the scrupulous, loving, cautious, careful inspection of the commercial cakes we find in a delicatessen window. And on the other hand, luminous oblong blur, Turrell thinks he can usher us just through the theatrical orchestration of light into the purest imaginable form of sublime and spiritual experience. It's a nice story about the Turrell, by the way, that when Turrell was a young man in art school in California, his favorite thing were the Rothkos that they showed in school, which you can see has a relationship, till he came to New York and saw the actual Rothkos and realized what he really liked were the slides of the Rothkos. And his art, in many respects, comes out of that realization. As I say, I could multiply, and if you go into this wonderful collection and looked around, I'm sure you too would find countless examples of this double urge. And this urge towards the extremes always, this urge towards the extremes, which seems profoundly American. That is to say, we can find inventory, cataloging, painting, many, many places where we look, but we rarely find it so often devoted to such seemingly modest subjects as we do in American art, birds and pastry. We can find a huge inventory of the art of the sublime, of romantic art, everywhere we go, but rarely do we see the search for the sublime pared down, simplified, until it becomes nothing but the pure glow of light itself. That taste for the extremes, that taste for either end, seems to be somehow ours. But rather than try and show you how this works over and over again, I wanted just to say a few words about why I think it's so. What is it in the American tradition, or if you like, the American character, that can explain it? It's something that that tormented me, having seen this push towards the extremes again and again in artists of the same generation. I wondered what could begin to explain it. And I came upon a wonderful text that I think comes as close to explaining it as any one text can explain a obviously complicated and many-sided cultural phenomenon. It's a text by George Santayana called Character and Opinion in the United States. Now, Santayana is one of those fascinating thinkers, both an American and a European, who ends his life in Europe, but lives and works for many years right at the heart of the first Cambridge Renaissance at Harvard, around James and Berenson and so on. Santayana is known for one statement now, which all of you know, that those who do not remember history are doomed to repeat it. Unfortunately, those of us who are aphorists have to live in fear that we will write one aphorism that you will all be doomed to remember while forgetting everything else we ever wrote or said. And Santayana is somewhat in that predicament. But in this book, Character and Opinion in the United States, he tries to explain exactly what I've been talking about, but he sees it not in terms of the history of the visual arts in America. He sees it in the terms of the history of philosophy in America. Now, it's a complicated argument, but in brief, what he's fascinated by is there are two great philosophers that he knew and of his generation just before his, in Cambridge, William James and his contemporary student, Josiah Royce. And James, of course, was the ultimate pragmatist, if you like, a painter of pure cake, someone who believed that what mattered in the world were the things of experience, and that what we gained our value not from permanent and transcendent ideas, but from the way we played with those things of experience in the endless games that life presented us with. But his student, Royce, takes exactly the opposite position. That is to say, he believes passionately in the absolute, the transcendent, in the common soul in which we all participate. And Santayana said to himself, how can it be that one generation, two people in enormous intelligence in dialogue would end with these extreme positions? And he said, essentially, it's because Americans don't believe in individual psychology. So they don't believe that lots of things are going on in your mind. And if you believe that all that matters are the things of the world, or then the natural thing to believe, the next thing to believe is that since the things of the world are registered in your mind, all there is the abstract categories of your mind. And that we're constantly going back and forth between a belief in the particular, the concrete, an extreme belief in the value of the particular and concrete, and then immediately a belief in the necessity of the abstract and absolute. And he gave a name to this syndrome. He called it the American Boomerang. He said, you will see it in every quarter, in every part of American life, the American boomerang, going back and forth. That Americans either make too great an investment in the virtues of the particular and concrete, or they rebound and they oversell the absolute, the transcendental. Now, I'll allow you all, as you're sitting here tonight, to fill in some of the blanks in that picture, because I think it's one that explains a lot of our politics, a lot of our religious thought. We are, if Santayana is to be believed, in a sense, an inherently intellectually polarized nation. And yet, it seems to me that one of the things that we can say about that is that if Santayana is right, if we do have a kind of natural tropism, a natural tendency towards the extreme case because we don't quite believe in the middle way, we have a hard time incorporating into our sense of ourselves the notion that the truth might lie somewhere in between. If that has been destructive for our politics, at times for our literature, for our philosophy, it has been, I think, a huge assist, a huge aid to our art. Because one of the things that's true about the visual arts, I believe, and one of the things that makes them very different from all of their sister arts and activities of the mind, is that they thrive on the edge. They thrive on the edge. We do not like art of the muddled middle. That's why there's so little English art that survives outside of England. Moderate art for a moderate people is inherently provincial. What matters to us, what we go to art for, is not the experience of the middle way, but always the experience of the extreme possibility. It's It's what draws us to art again and again. It's the thing that the visual arts do well that no other art does nearly as well. How then do we incorporate that understanding that there's something positive, something good, something thrilling about the extremities of American art? How do we incorporate that into a sane sense of ourselves as people? I've said that we have an institutional tendency to make American art be everything that it possibly can be. We throw and have thrown furniture and coins, shaker boxes into our conception of American art from very early on in a way that we don't do in any other part of the museum. And then I've said that within those constraints, we tend to see that the most potent art emerges from the extremes, either an extreme radical empiricism or from a particular absolute kind of transcendentalism. How to make sense of that? How should we approach it? How should we see it? It seems to me that when we think about American art in all of its forms, its institutional form, if you like, its essential form, that we've never more needed to employ and to assert the very old but ever necessary distinction between patriotism and nationalism. Patriotism, it seems to me, is inherently defensive and inclusive. It's a love of place and of the people around it. It is a willingness, a readiness, if you like, to see in the commonplaces of your own civic world, of your own experience, fit subjects for art, things to be proud of, things to have a deep allegiance and affection for. And that's been one of the very richest veins in American art, and one of the things that I think has moved it and brought it forward. Nationalism, on the other side, nationalism, on the other hand, is exactly the opposite. It's a constant, anxious assertion of your own exceptional nature and of your own superiority to others. Patriotism is the love of a particular land, of a particular place, and its particular traditions. Nationalism, the love of something much less tangible, the myth of a people, which can justify many things, political persecution first among them. Patriotism is in many respects old-fashioned and conservative in my mind, and nationalism modern and populism. I think that if we begin to try and understand that distinction, we begin to reassert that distinction, we can come back to the first problem I presented you with. That is to say, how on the one hand can we assert and inspect the continuities, the national continuities of American art without falling into the trap of simple chauvinism, without pretending that our art is important because we are important, that our art is exceptional because we are exceptional. And I think if we begin to think harder about the ways that the best of American art is rooted and expresses itself in these extremes exactly because the things we go searching for in our own experience are those parts that aren't held in common necessarily with the rest of the world, then I think we can move towards a patriotic vision of American art, which is not narrowly or destructively nationalist. At any moment, I'd want to suggest to you, the Americanness of American art is not, if you like, an essential property of it, but what scientists call an emergent property of the whole. By emergent properties, we mean any of those ways or those things that you can see them in many places, traffic patterns in cities or market phenomena in economics. Wherever you have a multitude of individuals interacting with one another, there often comes a moment when disorder gives way to order and something new emerges. A pattern, a decision, a structure, a change in direction. Emergent properties are exactly the things that transcend the essentialism of nationalism, the belief in our exceptionalism, and ask us to see the magical way in which continuities and similarities can be seen through the projection of a great and long history. One of my favorite small works of American art that comes to us from the margins but is very much part of the center is this St. Galden's design for a $20 gold coin. It's the single most beautiful coin, I think, ever minted or made anywhere. It was supposed to be put into circulation, but the relief, the bas relief on it is too deep, and it never, though Teddy Roosevelt commissioned it, it never was actually put into use. And what's wonderful about it, if you think about it as a symbol, is that what begins as a Nike of victory becomes a symbol simply of liberty. What begins as the winged goddess of war ends as liberty, the herald of freedom. If we walk the halls of the American museums that we love, if we take in reality the walk that I offered you in simulation at the beginning of tonight's talk, I don't think we'll ever be instructed of some necessary American essence, of something that sets us apart from the rest of the world. We'll see patterns, we'll see similarities, we'll see the beautiful working of the American boomerang. But what we will see is something that has to emerge from generation to generation through creative acts of free men and women. We will never be instructed uniformly of the American essence, since none exists. Instead, if we take those walks, we will emerge plurally as Americans who do. Thank you very much. Thank you. I realize as I came to my conclusion, I've thrown a tremendous number of ideas out there, some of them terribly metaphysical. This is what happens when you try to do a book in 45 minutes, present a book in 45 minutes. So I'd love to take your questions and see if I can particularize and explain some ideas that probably needed 100 pages to be fully comprehensible. Love to take your questions on this or anything else that's on your mind. First question is always the hardest, so someone be brave. Up here.
You talked about patriotism and nationalism,
Mm-hmm.
and as you were describing it, as you were describing patriotism, it sounded like that was the pluralistic choice,
Yes.
and I didn't understand that nationalism was. Can you explain that?
Oh, I'm sorry, I meant just the opposite. Yes, no, you're exactly right. I meant to say that patriotism, that is a feeling of affection for place, is the pluralistic choice.
Oh, okay.
And that we need to think about, we can think about American art in a rational way as having real continuities stretching through time. We don't have to just say, oh, we want to impose those. If we think of them in a patriotic and pluralistic way. That sums up my evening's talk perfectly.
And so, just one last thing. So, could you now, given that context, could you repeat what the right way that you thought about nationalism?
Well, what I think is that there's a danger in thinking about the continuities of American art. My brother, Blake Gopnik, eloquent art critic here at the Washington Post for many years, once wrote a very provocative piece in which he said, all this talk about American art, he was addressing it towards me, but he didn't say that quite. All this worrying about American art, which people are taking decades to do before they produce their book, is nonsensical, because the horizontal connections of American art, if you like, are much greater. That is, Richard Serra has more in common with a sculptor working in Spain or France than he does with Augustus St. Gaudens. And to try and construct a genealogy in which Serra and St. Gaudens are working off the circuit of the same kinds of energies is incredibly foolish. And my response to that is, it's foolish only if you think there's some national DNA that vibrates inside these works that makes them exceptionally ours. But if you think of them as responses to the broad range of American experience, which naturally and inevitably are going to vibrate in similar ways because we live in a similar place with similar recurring problems that American Boomerang, among many others, then I think you can talk sensibly about the continuities of American art without falling into the nationalist trap.
Thank you.
Over here.
Well, first of all, thanks for just a very original and thought-provoking talk. I really believe one of the better ones in this series, and I say that as someone who's been coming right from the start. But my question is on this idea of this expansive view that we take of American art, sort of, including all these things in it. It occurred to me that the rise of the sort of serious study of American art as an academic discipline pretty much coincided with the rise of American Studies, this program that originated, this American Civilization program at Harvard, where you study American history, not just through politics and economics and social history, but also through literature and art and architecture. Do you think that maybe that coincidence at least reinforced this tendency to sort of include everything, the fact that American art, the study of American art right from the start had this expansive?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a very good point, and one that I will make on a footnote someplace around page 110. But no, you're absolutely right. The idea of American studies has sort of imprinted in it the notion that we're studying American and studying Americana. We're not simply studying American art within the broader range of art history, that there's something worthwhile about looking at American philosophy and American literature and American art within the context of American social history, American economic history, American philosophy, and so on. Yes, I think that's absolutely true. One of the things I was going to say tonight, but it seemed to take me too far afield, is that it's one of the oddities of American cultural history that this now largely forgotten figure, Van Wyck Brooks, was writing a very monumental history of American literature in the 1940s, where he was saying quite self-consciously he wanted to give American writers a usable past. In other words, by looking at all of these minor figures from Washington Irving's time or from Emily Dickinson's time, that an American writer would have a usable past to draw on. And one of the things, I'm a big fan of those books, which I think are scandalously neglected now. But one of the oddities about it is they look very conservative now. And it was just at that moment that American art was sort of achieving its maturity, and it had to make up a usable past for itself. And one of the things I think it's true, and it's very abashing to those of us who are even amateur historians, essayists, or scholars of any kind, is that artists make up their own past. You can't supply it to them. You can't tell them this is your heritage. It's why I love that story about Turrell and the Rothko slide so much, right? That was the usable past for Turrell, and no seminar in American studies could have produced that. But yes, I think there's no question that the same impulse, to come back to your point, the same impulse to think of American experience in this very broad lens that led to the introduction of American studies as an academic subject is also part of what led to the American Wing, or at the Met, or this museum, to see their subject on much broader terms than the equivalent institutions devoted to European art would have done. Over here.
Well, I haven't had a chance to visit Crystal Bridges, the new museum in Arkansas. I'm wondering if you have, and if in any way as a new museum, if they've tried to in any way rethink Museum of American Art, or if it sort of follows in the same traditions.
Crystal Bridges is a new museum out. It's the only first-rate museum that has the name of a porno star, I've always felt. Whenever someone mentions it. Yes, you know, there's a larger issue here. One of the reasons that the exhibition High and Low, Modern Art and Popular Culture, that Kirk Varnado and I co-curated back in the antediluvian early 90s, was as controversial as it was because we were trying to break down the obvious decorum between the comic book and between R. Crumb and Philip Guston, most notably, or in one notable place, and so on. And I think that urge is very powerful in a place like Crystal Bridges. It's powerful. What's funny about it is when we were doing that in 1990, it seemed scandalous, and now it seems commonplace. And inevitably, I have ambivalent feelings about it. As one of the people who was nudging those dominoes over, I now remember how beautiful the dominoes looked when they were all standing upright. There's a kind of, and this is one of the things I was hoping to say, or at least to imply tonight, there's a kind of over-easy omnivorousness that we can inject into our cultural institutions. That is to say, not that our range of vision should be much wider than it conventionally has been in the past. I'm quite serious about thinking that something like that Sarah Woodridge miniature, which is not a big work of art that you can buy and sell at an auction house necessarily, has in every sense as much potency as both as an image in itself and as a symbol of American sexuality as anything that even Akins might have done. So that kind of expansion of vision, I think, is a terrific thing. The problem is when we begin to have an indiscriminate omnivorousness, when we simply say, we'll include it because it's there, and only the prejudiced and bigoted and reactionary people will insist on a hierarchy. The way we put it at the end of the book, High and Low, Modern Art and Popular Culture, is that a conclusion which, as far as I know, no one ever read, actually, is that the too hasty pluralist, the overeager, the greedy pluralist, thinks that by overturning categories, you've changed values. And the unduly hidebound reactionary thinks that by defending categories, you're defending values. Values and categories are two different things. We have to constantly inspect our categories, but we can't do that while dispensing with our values. Lady here.
I'm an artist and I'm not very verbal, so I'm going to say this a little bit slowly.
I'm very verbal, but I'm not an artist, so you have the advantage. You have the advantage on me.
Well, I was struck by your comment of the inclusiveness of Shaker furniture and basket making and whatever as American art, and I wonder if you notice that this has, this is not my observation, that contemporary art people are very exclusive of craft art, even to the point that there's a current call for entries out now that wants to see craft skill in artists but excludes craft workers from applying. So it has to be academic artists who are doing something with their hands, for God's sake. And I don't quite, so I don't quite see this inclusiveness that you speak about where the Museum of Art and Design,
you don't feel included. You feel,
separate.
right, that, I understand that. Let me answer your question on two different levels, if I may.
Yeah.
One is I was joking when I said I'm not an artist. That's true. But one of the things I've tried to do in the last few years, partly in preparation for trying to write this book, is to study drawing. I've been taking life drawing lessons for a while. I wrote about it last year in the New Yorker. And this is a very, very useful antidote to overly verbal art history. The act of looking at a naked body and trying to make sense of it on a sheet of paper is one of the great mental disciplines, not to mention even if your hand is trembling, the physical disciplines there is. So I have unlimited respect for anybody who can do anything well. Craft in that sense is, I think, an essential part of the story, but you're quite right that craft in the other sense, artisanal craft, things that are normally relegated sort of to secondary place, are more haphazardly integrated. My impression, and I could be wrong about this, is that integration is happening more and more. It's happening both historically, in the sense that I was talking about tonight, that no sane art historian writing a book about American art would ignore quilts while pursuing the Peel family. I think that we recognize that so much of what's best in our tradition comes from what are called and sometimes dismissed as craft traditions. And my own sense, quite possibly false, is that more and more for a younger generation of artists, incorporating craft traditions into what they want to be significant art is important. The catch whenever we talk about contemporary art is we're always talking about two things at once. We're talking about the places where creativity happens and the places where the market works. The market will always be tilted towards things that you can hold in your hand and sell for a significant price, and that doesn't have necessarily the tincture of mere craft. There are also, as I'm sure I don't have to tell you, there are deep questions about feminine in the question of craft. That is, Anonymous, very famously, was a woman. So much of what we look at and simply say is the anonymous art of artisanal people, it simply means it was a woman who never got to put her name on the work. So I think all of those issues come together. I would have a more optimistic telling of it than I think you would, but then you're the one on the battle line, and I am not. So.
Well, you may be talking about something that is more overarching than
Yes.
I am, and therefore interesting from that point of view.
I think perhaps so. Over here.
Now that economists and sociologists have told us that we have the huge income gap in our country, larger than any country in Europe or Japan or any developed country in the world, and that we may be poised to elect as our next president someone who is not an egalitarian in any way. How do you see American art in that contemporary world of ours, where we're a long way from being democratic or egalitarian?
There's a famous story at the New Yorker that when the late great editor William Shawn sent a team of reporters out to report on the Democratic National Convention, was held in New York in 1976. He said, "Now remember, no politics." And when you come to speak at the Smithsonian Institution, I think no one has to say you're the sort of implicit no politics. But of course, those of us who think passionately about these things slip our politics in insidiously underneath. And if any of you wanted to assume that by drawing that distinction between patriotism and nationalism, I was trying to draw a distinction between a sane, healthy, changing, pluralistic love of place on the one hand, and a narrow, hysterical, overwrought, and finally illusory attempt to persuade people not to see their own interests because of their over-identification with a fictional national spirit. If you wanted to imagine that I was making a political distinction, I can't help you. Thank you. Lady here.
Hi. We live today in an era of interconnectivity. And I'm wondering how you see contemporary art as being American in a
Global.
Increasingly connected global world, as well as this global art being so swayed by a powerful market.
This is a very profound question, and maybe we should make it the last one, because I think we're coming to the end of time, and it's hard to top that question as a question. Let me, again, try and answer it 3 levels, if I may. First, one of the things I was trying to say tonight, and I may not have articulated clearly, is that that crisis of art has been part of the American experience in art since its very beginning. Because though we see the cutting edge of it now in the sudden connectivity of the world, in the disruption of what seemed once a secure visual field into ever-changing and jumping and oscillating pixels, that basic crisis, what's the place of art in a world of technology, has been with us since at least the middle of the 19th century. And that's been a question. What does art do? What does art, the stuff we call art, whether it's artisanal or fine arts, whether it's me stumbling along trying to draw a shoulder, or whether it's Wayne Thiebaud trying to paint his cakes, what's it got for us? Is it just archaic? Is it just finished? That question about the place of the individual vision of the artist in a world of mass technology has been with us since the middle of the 19th century at least, and is foundational to American art. It's one of the questions that American artists take on again and again, sometimes with a kind of diabolical embrace, as in Andy Warhol, sometimes with purposeful rejection, as in Andrew Wyeth, let's say. So that's one thing I would say about it. It's been around for a long time. It's foundational to American art and helps explain a lot of what happens in it. Second thing I'd say is that the oddity of our time, the larger question about interconnectivity and globalization is that what we would have imagined, maybe even hoped for, when this new age began sometime around 1990. It really was a phenomenon of the 1990s. I moved to Paris in 1994, and I had never been on the internet, and by the year 2000, my life was simply emails connected with bursts of caffeine. That was the 6 years which changed the world, it seems to me, definitively, and for good. And we think that, oh, well, we're going to have one culture, one global culture, and it doesn't seem to work that way. The force of exactly that nationalism I was talking about before, force of language, the force of differences, good and evil, remains enormously powerful. So I don't see, for good or ill, a crisis of globalization in that sense. Certainly we see it in economics. Certainly we see it in lots of other ways. The force of language, for instance, which still divides people, remains very real. The force of nationalism, which divides people, remains very powerful. I think that the oddity of the time we're living in is that we live in a world in which we are simultaneously global citizens, in which I can flip on not just my computer, but my smartphone tonight and be, in a very real sense, in Beijing or in Bombay watching a cricket match. And at the same time, I recognize that my experience, our experience, is made up of these myriad small connections, little observations, common manners, shared moments that give us a particular place and sense of ourselves as a unique people.
Is there an American artist you would say that encapsulates an Americanism today in the sense of contemporary art? Like here at the Hirshhorn, we just opened the show of I, We, and at the National Gallery, we are now opening Liechtenstein. When I looked at Liechtenstein's work, there is, to me, a total encapsulation of Americanism in that work.
Tell you just quickly, one of the people who loomed large in that high and low show back when was Liechtenstein, and one of the things we did was to actually, for the first time, go back and find all of the artists who had drawn the cartoons, the comic books, that he had used as sources for his most famous pictures, and we interviewed them and talked to them about their own experience as image makers. And one of the things that is true was you couldn't do it now because they would all have lawyers. The world is lawyered up in the intermediate time. Who's the artist who does that? What one artist? I would hate to give you a single name, but it does seem to me that when I look around, when I go for a walk, not through the American Wing, but through Chelsea and look at the galleries, that push and pull between the global, the common, the pixelated, and the particular remains incredibly powerful. And it's one of the things that strikes me is if you look at the realists, perhaps not of this generation, but of my generation just past, painters like Eric Fischl and David Sally, for instance, one of the things that's striking is how much emotional energy they get out of the assertion of a particular place. One backyard, one barbecue, one Adirondack chair have enormous resonance in our lives right now, exactly because I think that the hunger for the particular is almost synonymous now with the hunger for art. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for listening. We have a reception. I'd love to talk to you some more.